that strange sensation when you touch something you shouldn't. That cold shiver that runs down your spine, like 1,000 invisible fingers walking across your skin. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of someone who completely ignored that primitive warning from the body and paid a price he never imagined possible. There's something deeply disturbing about ancient bones. They carry memories, echoes of life that once pulsed through them. But when those bones belong to a creature that defied the very laws of nature, that transition between two worlds, the human and the bestial, then you're dealing with something much more sinister than simple mortal remains. Our story begins on a seemingly ordinary morning when a man decided to explore an abandoned trail in the mountains. He was one of those practical types, skeptical by nature, who laughed at superstitions and local legends. The kind of person who sees an ancient skull and thinks only of its value as a decorative piece, never of the dark forces that might be sleeping within its porous bones. The trail wound through a dense forest where sunbeams could barely penetrate the canopy of intertwined leaves. The air had that humid, earthy smell characteristic of places where death and rebirth dance eternally together. Dry branches crackled under his feet, creating a sinister rhythm that echoed among the trees like primitive funeral music. That's when he saw it. A small cave, almost hidden by a curtain of ivy that hung like the hair of an ancient witch. Something drew him to that place, a magnetic force he couldn't explain. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was already the beginning of something much darker taking control of his will. Inside the cave, the darkness was almost palpable. His flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing rough walls covered by moisture that glistened like frozen tears. The floor was covered with dead leaves and small animal bones that had sought refuge there only to find their end. But at the back of the cave, on a natural ledge of rock, was the object that would change his life forever. The wolf skull was magnificently preserved, as if it had been carefully mummified by some supernatural process. Its teeth still gleamed with pearlescent enamel, and the empty sockets seemed to stare at him with an intensity that defied any logical explanation. There was something hypnotic about that object, something that whispered silent promises of power and ancient knowledge. Without hesitating, he reached out his hand. The moment his fingers touched the cold bone, a wave of energy coursed through his arm like liquid electricity. For an instant, fragmented images flashed through his mind, glimpses of full moon nights, of wild hunts through dark forests, of an insatiable thirst for something he couldn't name. But these visions lasted only seconds, and he dismissed them as products of his overstimulated imagination. The skull was surprisingly light in his hands, as if it were made of solidified air. Small cracks ran across its surface, creating patterns that resembled ancient runes or symbols from some language lost in time. When he brought the object closer to his flashlight, he could see that something was carved into the base of the skull. Deliberate marks made by human hands, suggesting this wasn't just the remains of a common animal. The temperature of the cave seemed to have plummeted since he touched the skull. His breath now formed small clouds of vapor, and he could feel a cold that penetrated to his bones. But strangely, the skull in his hands radiated a subtle warmth, almost imperceptible, as if some spark of life still pulsed within it. He knew he should leave it where he found it. Every primitive instinct in his body screamed for him to drop the object and flee from that cursed cave. But there was something stronger than fear, an irresistible compulsion that forced him to keep the skull glued to his palms. It was as if the object itself had developed a will of its own and chosen him as its new guardian. As he walked back along the trail, the skull carefully wrapped in his jacket, he began to notice small changes around him. The sounds of the forest seemed sharper, more defined. He could hear the racing heartbeat of a small rodent hidden among the leaves meters away. The smell of damp earth and decomposing vegetation became almost overwhelming in its intensity. Arriving home, he carefully cleaned the skull with a soft brush, removing centuries of dust and moss that had accumulated in its crevices. Each movement revealed more details of the extraordinary piece he had found. The fangs were disproportionately large for a common wolf, curved like miniature sabers that gleamed with an almost metallic luster. Most disturbing were the symbols carved into the base. The more he studied them, the more they seemed to move and reorganize before his eyes, as if they were written in some living substance that reacted to his gaze. He spent hours trying to decipher them, consulting books on ancient runes and occult symbols, but nothing came close to those intricate and hypnotic patterns. He decided to give the skull a place of honor on his shelf, among other archaeological finds he had collected over the years. But there was something different about this piece. While his other treasures remained inert, simple decorative objects, the skull seemed to pulse with its own energy. Even when he wasn't looking directly at it, he could feel its presence like a constant weight on his consciousness. The changes began that very night. His dreams, normally confused fragments of the day's memories, became vivid and disturbing narratives. He ran through dark forests with supernatural speed, his bare feet barely touching the ground covered with leaves. He could feel the wind cutting through his fur that shouldn't exist, as he pursued prey that always remained out of reach. He woke every morning more exhausted than when he had gone to bed, as if he had actually spent the night running through the wilderness. His nails grew at an alarming rate, and he found himself constantly biting them, developing a nervous habit he had never had before. His hearing became sharper each day, to the point where he could hear neighbors' conversations through the walls of his house. During the day, he found himself staring fixedly at the skull, losing himself in its empty sockets that seemed to contain all the dark wisdom of the world. There were moments when he swore he saw a red glow pulsing in the depths of those eye cavities, like almost extinguished embers that threatened to reignite at any moment. His eating habits also began to change. Rare meat, which had previously disgusted him, became increasingly attractive. He found himself at the local butcher shop, asking for increasingly rare cuts, until he finally began eating the meat almost raw, savoring the metallic taste of blood that dripped between his teeth. People around him began to notice changes in his behavior. His eyes, once gentle and warm, acquired a predatory gleam when someone came too close. He developed a more tense posture, always alert, like an animal ready to attack or flee. Mundane conversations irritated him deeply, and he found himself growling softly when contradicted. But maybe you're wondering, why didn't he get rid of the skull when he noticed these strange changes? The answer is simple and terrifying. He couldn't anymore. The object had become part of him in a way that defied any rational explanation. It was as if invisible threads connected his soul to those ancient bones, and cutting them would mean tearing pieces of himself away. If you're following this sinister story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our supernatural tales. And tell me in the comments, have you ever found an object that seemed to carry its own energy? Your experience could be the next topic of our haunted videos. The nights became the most terrifying period of his existence. It wasn't just because of the disturbing dreams that haunted him, but because of the growing difficulty in distinguishing between reality and nightmare. He woke up with dirt under his nails, branches stuck in his hair, and a wild taste in his mouth that he couldn't identify. His sleepwear appeared torn in the morning, as if he had fought a fierce battle against some invisible enemy. The bathroom mirror began to reflect changes that terrified him deeply. His canines were visibly longer and sharper, emerging like small fangs that cut his tongue when he tried to speak. His eyes, once a soft brown, now gleamed with golden reflections that seemed to capture and amplify any light source. Most disturbing was how his face seemed to be subtly reorganizing itself, his nose becoming more prominent and angular, as if he were slowly transforming into something that wasn't entirely human. During the day, he tried to rationalize these changes. Maybe it was stress, a delayed nervous breakdown, or some kind of allergic reaction to the mold from the cave. But deep in his soul, he knew he had touched something that should have remained buried forever. The skull on his shelf pulsed with growing malevolence, and he could swear the symbols carved into its base changed position when he wasn't looking directly at them. His social interactions became practically impossible. People's smell bothered him intensely. Some aromas were nauseating, others awakened a hunger he preferred not to examine too closely. He could detect fear in others through subtle changes in their body odor, and this awakened something primitive and predatory in his mind that terrified him. Work became a constant challenge. Meetings left him claustrophobic and agitated, and he found himself looking out the window, yearning for the freedom of open spaces. His hands trembled when he needed to handle papers, not from nervousness, but because his nails had grown and hardened to such an extent that they resembled claws more than normal human nails. It was during one of these torturous nights that he finally witnessed the true extent of his transformation. He woke up in his backyard, completely naked, with the taste of fresh blood in his mouth. Memory fragments returned like violent waves. The sensation of running on all fours, the excitement of the hunt, the primitive pleasure of tearing fresh flesh with teeth that had become lethal weapons. Beside him, the mangled remains of a small domestic animal lay scattered across the grass. The horror of what he had done, or what he had become, hit him like a hammer. His hands, now ending in true claws, trembled as he tried to comprehend the magnitude of his transformation. He was no longer completely human, but he also wasn't entirely beast. He was something trapped between two worlds, an abomination that belonged to neither. The mirror in his room reflected his new reality that morning. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing facial features that maintained his essential humanity, but were distorted by bestial changes. His human eyes gleamed with a mixture of rage and pain that cut through his soul like razors. His nose and mouth had partially elongated toward a snout, with fangs emerging between his lips. His skin remained human, but was now speckled with patches of dark, coarse fur. The transformation was no longer something that happened only during sleep. He could feel it approaching like an internal storm, a growing pressure that accumulated in his bones and muscles until it became unbearable. It always began with a piercing pain at the base of his skull, exactly where he had first touched that cursed object. The pain spread like liquid fire through his spine, radiating to every fiber of his being. His muscles contracted and expanded involuntarily, as if they were being resculpted by invisible hands. The sound of bones reorganizing echoed inside his head, like branches breaking in a dark forest. His orange shirt, the same one he wore the day he found the skull, hung in tatters from his increasingly muscular torso, torn by the dramatic changes in his anatomy. During these partial transformations, he found himself growling at his own reflection, one clawed hand raised in attack position while the other held his own chest, trying to contain the beast that roared to be freed. The creature he was becoming wasn't completely human nor entirely animal. It was something much more terrifying, an impossible fusion that defied all laws of nature. The skull on his shelf seemed to react to each of his transformations. During the most intense episodes, he could see a red light pulsing inside the empty sockets, synchronized with the beats of his own racing heart. The symbols carved into the bone glowed with a sinister phosphorescence, as if they were being written by a ghostly hand that existed beyond the veil of reality. He tried several times to get rid of the cursed object. He took it back to the cave where he had found it, but his hands refused to let go of it. It was as if the skull had developed its own gravity that kept it glued to his palms. He tried to burn it, but the flames refused to touch it, curving around the bone as if it were protected by some invisible force field. With each frustrated attempt to rid himself of his curse, the transformation accelerated. His body was adapting to the new reality in a way that horrified him. His senses had become so sharp that he could hear conversations blocks away and detect the smell of blood through concrete walls. The world had become a different place for him, full of sensory information that his human mind struggled to process. People began to avoid him instinctively. There was something about his presence that awakened primitive fear in others, a flight response coded into humanity's most basic instincts. Children cried when he approached, and domestic animals fled in panic, as if they could sense the beast that dwelt beneath his apparently human skin. He began to live as a recluse, leaving home only when absolutely necessary and always during the day, when the skull's influence seemed weaker. But even these precautions weren't enough to contain what had been awakened within him. The waxing moon in the night sky exerted a magnetic attraction on his corrupted soul, calling him to completely embrace his new nature. During the nights of most intense transformation, he found himself before the skull, whispering words in a language he didn't recognize, but which his throat seemed to know instinctively. It was as if ancestral memories were being awakened, dark knowledge that had remained dormant in the depths of his human genetics for millennia. The most terrifying discovery came when he found an old diary hidden in his own house, in a secret compartment of the attic that he had never noticed before. The yellowed pages contained the handwriting of someone who had lived on the property decades earlier, someone who had gone through the same curse that now consumed him. The trembling words told a story that perfectly mirrored his own experience. The diary revealed that the skull belonged to an ancestral creature, a primordial werewolf that had terrorized the region centuries ago. Its death hadn't been an end, but merely a transformation. Its malignant essence had taken refuge in the bones, patiently waiting for someone foolish enough to touch it and become a new host for its insatiable hunger. Each person who had found the skull over the years had gone through the same horrible progression. First came the dreams, then the subtle physical changes, followed by partial transformation and finally, complete surrender to the inner beast. The pattern was always the same, as if following a predetermined ritual that had been repeated countless times throughout the centuries. Most disturbing was discovering that he wasn't the first inhabitant of his own house to be cursed. The previous owner had hidden the diary as a warning to future residents, but also as a confession of his own crimes. The final pages described nights of hunting in the surrounding forests, the taste of fresh blood, and the terrible pleasure of giving vent to humanity's most primitive instincts. The diary's last entry was unfinished, interrupted in the middle of a sentence describing a particularly violent transformation. Dark stains on the pages suggested it wasn't ink that had smudged the final words. He realized with growing horror that he was destined to continue that sinister narrative, to add his own experiences to that chronicle of curse and transformation. The transformations now happened almost every night. He woke up in different places each morning, sometimes in his house's basement, other times in the open fields that surrounded the property. His neighbors began reporting sightings of a strange creature wandering the region, something that walked the thin line between man and wolf, but wasn't completely either. The mirror in his room had become his greatest enemy. With each glance, he saw less of his original humanity and more of the emerging beast. His posture had changed permanently. He now moved with the predatory grace of a born hunter, always alert, always ready to attack. His hands rarely relaxed completely, the claws always partially extended as constant reminders of his new nature. The skull was no longer just an object on his shelf. It had become the center of an improvised altar that he built unconsciously during his transformation episodes. Candles appeared around it, lit by hands he didn't remember using. Symbols were drawn on the floor with substances he preferred not to identify, forming patterns that seemed to pulse with their own life. During his last nights of lucidity, he tried to document his own experience, adding pages to the found diary. But his hands shook so much that the words came out distorted, and several times he found himself writing in symbols he didn't recognize, using the same ancestral language he had seen on the cursed skull. The beast within him was no longer an invader. It had become an integral part of who he was. In moments of most intense transformation, he could feel his human memories being pushed to the background, replaced by primordial instincts and a hunger that transcended any normal physical need. The last entry he managed to write with his own hands dates from a night when the moon was almost full. The words come out trembling, almost illegible, as if they had been written by someone fighting against a force trying to control every movement of his fingers. He describes the sensation of watching his own life through a stranger's eyes, as if his human consciousness had become merely a passenger in his own body. The skull had begun to whisper to him during his nightly vigils. They weren't words he could consciously understand, but his corrupted soul perfectly comprehended every syllable of that dark language. The promises were seductive: power beyond human imagination, freedom from the limitations of morality, and a hunger that could finally be satisfied without restrictions or remorse. His last days of lucidity were marked by an internal battle that tore apart his sanity. Part of him still desperately clung to his humanity, terrified by what he had become. But a growing portion of his essence embraced the transformation, delighting in the sharpened senses, supernatural strength, and wild freedom that the curse offered. The house around him began to reflect his mental deterioration. The walls were scratched by claws, furniture had been overturned and broken during his most violent transformations. The smell of blood and damp earth permeated every room, as if the very structure of the building was being corrupted by the presence of the creature he had become. Neighbors reported increasingly frequent sightings of the dark figure that wandered the property. Some swore they had seen a silhouette that walked upright like a man, but moved with the predatory fluidity of a wolf. Others spoke of eyes that gleamed in the darkness, reflecting light like golden mirrors, full of an intelligence that was simultaneously human and bestial. During his last documented transformation, he found himself before the mirror once more, but now the reflected image no longer terrified him. The creature that stared back at him had his dark hair slicked back, human eyes that gleamed with a mixture of rage and pain, and facial features that maintained his human essence, even as they distorted toward the bestial. His human skin was speckled with patches of fur, and his orange shirt hung in tatters from his muscular torso. He raised a clawed hand toward the reflection, no longer in horror, but in recognition. The other hand held his own chest, feeling the heart that beat with the wild rhythm of a creature that had finally found its true nature. The growl that emerged from his throat was no longer one of agony, but of acceptance. The diary found in the attic now contains a new entry, written in handwriting that gradually deteriorates until it becomes incomprehensible symbols. The last legible words simply say, "The hunger never stops. The skull waits." After that, only ancient symbols that seem to move on the page when observed for too long. The property remains inhabited, but its new occupant is rarely seen during the day. The skull still rests in its place of honor, patiently waiting for the next curious visitor who will be foolish enough to touch it. Because some curses don't end with a single victim, they perpetuate themselves through the centuries, passing from soul to soul like a spiritual infection that can never be truly cured. And so the story continues somewhere in the dark mountains, where a small cave still guards secrets that should remain buried forever. The cycle is complete, but it hasn't ended. It never really ends. If this story awakened something dark in your imagination, don't forget to subscribe to the Full Moon Howls channel for more narratives that explore the darkest corners of human experience. Share in the comments your own experiences with cursed objects or supernatural encounters. Your story could be the next one we tell to our community of horror lovers. And if this tale managed to make your heart race, leave your like so we can continue bringing these macabre journeys that dwell on the border between reality and nightmare.